She walked through airport security with a valid passport and a calm smile. 5 minutes later, they were slicing through her identity like it was forged. They didn't ask questions. They made assumptions. What they didn't know. She's not just anyone's wife. She is the system they thought they controlled. And now, their quiet mistake is about to become a national reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning hum of Atlanta International Airport was familiar, predictable, like a well-rehearsed symphony that had played daily for decades. Streams of travelers coasted through security lines with practiced ease, their suitcases wheeling behind them like obedient shadows. The intercom repeated boarding calls in crisp tones, while departure screens blinked above like an artificial sky. The world here was structured, timed, indifferent. In the luxury wing of the terminal, a different kind of rhythm played out. The clink of polished shoes on marble. The soft rustle of newspapers. Lattes poured into porcelain, not paper. Here the travel experience wasn't about urgency. It was about image. Reputation. Distance from inconvenience. Seated near the tall windows that overlooked the runway was Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq. The man who once dominated courts now sat in stillness. A tower of calm, amid the motion. A navy bomber jacket framed his broad shoulders. Designer sneakers kept his size 22 feet grounded. His phone remained face down on the side table. In his hands a steaming cup of coffee. There was no entourage, no noise, just him. A man who had learned how to be both seen and invisible, in the same breath. Across from him, Shawnee Henderson moved with unspoken precision. Tall, poised, and wrapped in a charcoal gray travel set that balanced grace with understated power. She reviewed their travel documents, boarding passes, identification, visas. Her hands didn't tremble. Her mind didn't race. Shawnee had spent years moving through elite circles, where her confidence was both armor and invitation. They were headed to Morocco for a charity summit, an initiative close to Shawnee's heart. Literacy girls' education, digital equity. It wasn't about photo ops. It was about roots, impact, service. Shaq had followed her lead, as he often did outside the arena. She wasn't just his wife. She was the reason he stayed grounded when fame tried to lift him too far from the floor. "Everything's here," she said, glancing up. Her voice was low, firm, and beautifully unhurried. Shaq smiled faintly. "You always double-check. And that's why nothing falls apart," she replied, slipping the documents back into the slim black folder. Shaq chuckled, more breath than sound. "You go on ahead. I'll join in 5. Need to grab a call." Shawnee kissed his cheek, quick but deliberate, and stood. She moved like a metronome, purpose in every step, grace in every angle. She passed through the lounge doors into the regular flow of travelers, with ease. Even among the crowd, she stood out, not loud, not flashy, but undeniable. She reached the TSA checkpoint, removed her coat, placed her bag in the tray, and stepped forward. The officer on duty took her passport. His expression remained blank at first, but then his eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. She saw it, the flicker. It wasn't about the name. It was about the way she carried herself, the way she didn't flinch. The officer scanned the passport again, frowned, scanned it a third time. He didn't return it. "Step to the side, ma'am. We need to take a closer look." Shawnee blinked once. No expression broke through. She stepped aside, calm, unmoved. She had flown internationally dozens of times. Nothing about her documents was unusual. But the mood had shifted. 2 more officers approached, one older, one younger. She noticed how the younger one hovered too long by the edge of the table, like waiting for a signal. The older officer examined the passport as if it might unravel in his hands. Then came the words, "This document doesn't look right." Shawnee tilted her head. "Excuse me?" "The lamination's inconsistent. There's a strip that feels tampered." "It's a federal passport," she replied, evenly. "Issued 3 years ago. It's been scanned at over 10 global entry points. We're gonna have to detain it for analysis." They didn't use the word fake, not yet, but she could hear it forming in the room's temperature. One of the officers placed the passport on a small desk, pulled out a utility knife and began to peel at the edge. Shawnee watched in silence as the corner was sliced. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor." "That can be arranged. But first we need to confirm you are who you claim to be." She felt the echo of that sentence hit deeper than intended. This wasn't about the passport. Not really. It was about the doubt, the hesitation, the way they needed to dissect her before allowing her forward. Meanwhile, Shaq was still in the lounge, scrolling through a message from their foundation's director. When he glanced up at the time, Shawnee should have been texting him by now. Boarding area, gate change, anything. A small crease formed between his eyebrows. He called. No answer. His stomach tightened. He stood, not rushed, but purposeful. At the checkpoint, the officers now spoke in lower voices, glancing at Shawnee's face, then down at the torn passport again. They had begun something they weren't sure how to undo. She remained still, hands at her side, back straight. Watch. A fourth officer entered the scene. This one had authority written in his stride. Shawnee recognized the shift instantly. He wasn't here to ask. He was here to reframe. Ma'am, we're going to escort you to a private screening area. It's standard protocol. That word again. Standard. A shield they used to hide behind. Shawnee didn't resist. She nodded once, took her bag and followed. Behind her, the cut passport remained on the desk. Proof of suspicion, evidence of assumption, and a crack in the system that had begun to splinter wider than anyone realized. Upstairs, Shaq stood just outside the lounge, staring at the checkpoint. Shawnee wasn't there. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. O'Neill? This is Officer Rayner with TSA. We've had an incident involving your wife's travel documents. She's with our compliance team. There's nothing to worry about. Shaq's voice was soft but unmissable. Where is she? In our private interview suite. She's safe. I'm on my way. He hung up. He didn't ask permission. He didn't shout. But every step he took from that moment on would change how this airport and the people inside it remembered this day. The flight was no longer the destination. Truth was. And truth had just been delayed. By protocol. The TSA checkpoint pulsed with routine efficiency. Lines coiled like sluggish rivers. Scanners beeped in timed intervals. Uniformed agents called for laptops, belts, shoes. Nothing felt extraordinary, just the usual stream of travelers, each gripping passports and tickets like lifelines. Shawnee Henderson stepped forward, poised in a beige trench coat over a cream travel set, her afro tucked neatly into a silk wrap. She carried herself with the quiet elegance of someone used to rooms shifting when she entered, not out of arrogance but presence. Her stride was unhurried, the same calm she wore as a former PR strategist turned philanthropist. Her husband Shaquille waited just beyond security in the VIP lounge. Their destination, São Paulo, where their foundation was opening a new children's tech lab. She approached the glass booth, offering her passport and boarding pass with a nod. The officer on the other side barely glanced up before taking them. Shawnee watched his eyes flick between the documents and her face once. Then again, longer the second time. His brow furrowed. Hold on a sec, he muttered, already pressing a button beneath his desk. Shawnee's gaze tracked his movements, noting the subtle twitch in his fingers. The way his tone changed tightened. She said nothing. The second officer appeared in under a minute, walking with the brisk efficiency of someone used to unspoken protocols. He didn't introduce himself, just took the passport and turned it in his hands, back and forth like it might reveal a secret if flipped enough times. He examined the microchip area with a penlight, his lips pursed. She says she's traveling to Brazil? Yes, Shawnee replied evenly. You go there often. I'm on the board of an international education nonprofit. We have a launch event there. The officer said nothing. He held her gaze a second too long, then walked away with the passport. Shawnee glanced around. Other travelers passed without pause. An older white man breezed through with a tattered document barely scanned. A younger woman laughed as a TSA agent complimented her shoes. But Shawnee stood still, waiting, seen but not believed. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Another officer appeared, this one with a clipboard and a sharper look in his eye. He approached with authority. No introduction. Ma'am, we need to take a closer look at your passport. Step aside, please. Shawnee obeyed, stepping to the side cordon. Her heart beat faster now, not from guilt, but from the familiar sting of being pulled aside for something that was never quite explained. The officer unzipped a padded envelope, and without ceremony, slipped her passport into a device. The machine hummed. He watched the screen, then frowned, then did something that made Shawnee's breath catch. He took a utility knife from his pocket and sliced along the binding seam of her passport. Stop, she said, louder than intended. He glanced up. Unbothered. Standard test for tampering. You'd be surprised how often we get fakes. That's a federal document. We're federally authorized, he said flatly. Shawnee took a step back, not out of fear but control. She inhaled slowly. The conversation around her dimmed. She was aware of the eyes. The people watching. Some curious, others detached. No one intervened. No one asked if she was okay. The whispers began to ripple outward from behind the podium. Possible identity fraud. She doesn't match the system. Could be one of those new digital forgeries. The blade clicked shut. The officer held the now damaged passport and looked up at her. You're going to need to come with us to a secondary screening room. For what? Verifying your identity. I gave you government-issued ID. You destroyed it. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward a side hallway. Shawnee stood rooted. Her pulse thudded in her neck, but her voice didn't shake. Before I follow anyone, I want to know what triggered this. Your document raised internal flags. Be specific. He hesitated, just long enough to make the truth louder in its absence. Your name doesn't match the travel history we expected. Shawnee blinked. Expected based on what? The silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was political. Still she moved. Deliberate. Silent. The hallway swallowed her steps. Behind her, the terminal carried on. Luggage wheels rolled. Boarding calls echoed. And no one saw the identity of a black woman sliced at the spine and called protocol. In the screening room, the lights were colder. The walls were beige, but not warm. One chair, one desk, a mounted camera. Shawnee sat. She said nothing. Let them speak first. Another agent entered, younger, less assured. He carried a tablet and wore discomfort like a loose uniform. He tapped the screen nervously. We need to ask a few verification questions. For record keeping. Shawnee met his eyes. Do you need my husband for this? The agent looked puzzled. I'm sorry? Shaquille O'Neal. He's waiting in the Delta Sky Club. You might have seen him on your way in. Very tall. Very quiet. The agent froze. Throat bobbing. Shawnee smiled softly. Not smug. Not vindictive. Just controlled. Would you like me to call him, or would you? He stepped out of the room without answering. Minutes passed.
Then the door opened again.
This time, a man in a blazer, not TSA but administration, entered with urgency, disguised as calm. His voice was smoother, apologetic. His tone landed somewhere between corporate regret and legal shielding. Mrs. O'Neal, he began. We seem to have had a procedural overstep. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Shawnee said nothing. He cleared his throat. We'd like to escort you to the VIP lounge and restore your travel clearance immediately. We've also initiated a review of the incident. She stood. Slowly. What was the trigger? I believe there was a misread flag. A glitch in the biometric system. Was it the flag or the face? He looked away. Shawnee walked out of the room without another word. But the silence she left behind felt like indictment. Back at the lounge, Shaq stood as she approached, reading her face before she spoke. Her eyes gave him everything. He pulled out his phone. Not to call for help, but to record a story. Because this wasn't just about Shawney's passport. It was about every woman whose name got questioned before her voice was heard. Every person whose skin tone shifted suspicion in a room meant for trust. And Shawnee? She hadn't lost anything. She had just uncovered everything. The hallway they led, Shawnee through, was narrow, colorless. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold wash over the sterile linoleum. Every step away from the terminal felt like a descent, silent, clinical, and deliberate. No one made eye contact. No one explained where she was going. Just two officers, one ahead, one behind. Escort, not arrest. Yet the unease in the air suggested otherwise. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Shawnee didn't speak. Her breathing remained steady, but her pulse ticked up with each door they passed. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, the sound too sharp in the hush. They reached a steel-framed door labeled secondary screening. The lead officer opened it and motioned for her to enter. The room was small. No windows. No decor. Just a table, 3 chairs and a wall-mounted camera. She took her seat across from the blank wall. One of the officers remained behind. Posture stiff, eyes unreadable. She noted the room layout, the way the table was bolted to the floor, the slight hum of a vent that felt too loud, designed to disarm, not physically, but psychologically. After a few minutes, another man entered. Clean-shaven, mid-40s, khakis and a Department of Homeland Security badge clipped to his belt. He didn't offer his name. He sat across from her and tapped a folder against the table once, like it was meant to signal something. Then came the first question, without preamble. Where were you born? Shawnee tilted her head slightly. Washington, D.C. Have you ever traveled to the Middle East in the last 5 years? Yes. Jordan, for a women's education summit. Saudi Arabia, briefly, UN business. He jotted something down. And your connection to the last name O'Neill. Shawnee blinked. Excuse me? Your passport says Shawnee Henderson. Are you legally married? She stared at him. That's an odd way to phrase that. Is it a legal name? She nodded. For 9 years. I've carried that name on every travel document since. Why does this matter? He didn't answer. And how did you acquire this visa for Brazil? I didn't acquire anything. Our foundation arranged the travel clearance through consular priority. I'm on their board of directors. He paused, watching her. Do you carry dual citizenship? No. Do you work for a federal agency? No. Have you ever been questioned at an international checkpoint before? She crossed her arms gently, not defensive, composed. Not like this. The questions kept coming. Measured, civil, but with an undertone she couldn't ignore. Each one chipped away at her presence. The man never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Judgment was dressed in calm. Meanwhile, 2 gates away, Shaquille O'Neal sat in the Delta Sky Club, fingers drumming lightly on the table. He had just finished a call with a foundation partner when he noticed the time. Shachi had been gone too long. The line she'd entered should have cleared in minutes. He pulled out his phone, sent a quick message. Shaq, everything good, baby? No response. He waited a beat, then sent another. Shaq, you stuck in line? Want me to walk back? Still nothing. His jaw tightened slightly. Shawnee wasn't one to leave a text hanging, especially not when they were traveling internationally. He glanced up at the monitor. Their flight was still on time. Boarding hadn't begun. He stood, walked toward the window, scanned the terminal below. No, Shawnee. Back in the screening room, the agent tapped his pen against the folder again. Shawnee watched his hands, calm but calculating. You listed your occupation as executive director, he said. Of what exactly? Arkline Foundation. Social equity programs. Domestic and global. Your funding sources. Private. Corporate partnerships. My husband is one of our primary benefactors. Name. She stared him down. You already know it. He flipped the folder shut. We're just trying to confirm details. Shawnee didn't move. What is it you think I've done? We don't think anything, he replied too quickly. This is routine. Routine doesn't usually require dismantling a passport. He hesitated, just slightly. Then he stood. We'll verify a few more details. Sit tight. He left. The door clicked behind him. Shawnee leaned back, exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the camera in the corner. She knew what this was. She'd worked in high-level rooms long enough to recognize when power tried to cloak discomfort in process. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was focused. Something had triggered this, not a red flag in a system. A red flag in a person. Shaq stood now near the security line, scanning faces. He asked a passing officer if they'd seen a woman matching Shawnee's description. The officer barely registered his concern. Shaq kept calm, but something in his gut twisted. He returned to the lounge and asked the concierge to check if anyone under the last name O'Neill had been flagged for screening. The attendant froze momentarily, typing quickly. Sir, I can't disclose that information. Shaq's voice was low, steady. I'm not asking for security codes. I'm asking where my wife is. She hasn't answered her phone. She's not at the gate. She's not in this lounge. Someone in your system knows where she is. The attendant shifted nervously. Sir, if there's been an issue, TSA would handle it internally. But, he paused. There was a hold reported on a female passenger, secondary ID verification. That's all I can see. Shaq's jaw clenched. Was her passport cut? The man looked startled. I don't know. Shaq didn't speak again. He turned and walked out of the lounge, his pace deliberate now, retracing the hallway toward the checkpoint, scanning each uniform, each door. His presence drew glances, people recognizing him, whispering, stepping back. But none of that mattered now. Shawnee sat alone, staring at her hands. Her phone still hadn't been returned. Her passport lay on the desk, its corner sliced, the cut clean and cruel. She thought about the stories she'd read, the women who'd sat in rooms like this and been forced to explain their existence from the ground up. She wasn't here because of a threat. She was here because someone decided she didn't belong. The door opened again. A new agent this time, older, clearly more senior. He looked at her like he knew who she was, or had just been told. He nodded, awkwardly. "Mrs. O'Neill, there seems to have been a procedural misstep." She didn't respond. "We're going to release you immediately. Your boarding will be prioritized. A representative will escort you to your husband." Shawnee stood.
"No thank you, no nod, just movement."
As they walked, she noticed the change in tone from the staff, who passed her in the hall. Nervous, apologetic, not remorseful, just aware. They exited into the terminal, and for a moment the light felt too bright, the noise too sharp, and then she saw him. Shaq stood at the intersection near the lounge, eyes locked on her. He didn't smile. He didn't call her name. He just stepped forward, wrapped her in his arms, and whispered, "You good?" Shawnee nodded into his chest, but her eyes stayed open, watching, remembering. This wasn't over. This wasn't forgettable, because judgment wrapped in policy still cuts deep. And Shawnee had just been reminded how far this country still had to go, even when your name was O'Neill. Shaq paced near the curved glass wall of the Delta Sky Club, trying to shake the tight coil forming at the base of his neck. It had been nearly 40 minutes. Shawnee should have returned by now. He checked his phone again. Still no messages, no missed calls. Her read receipts hadn't even changed. A stillness settled in his gut. Not panic, but something older, instinctual. Something wasn't right. He approached the concierge desk once more, voice level, but firmer now. "My wife, Shawnee Henderson. She went through security almost an hour ago. She hasn't come back. She's not at the gate. I've tried her phone. No answer. You told me earlier someone was flagged. I need more than that." The attendant, clearly flustered now, began to stammer. "Sir, with TSA cases, there's a lot of internal handling. We don't usually get notified unless..." Shaq cut in, not with anger, but with a quiet edge. "Unless what?" The attendant hesitated. "Unless it's escalated." Shaq leaned in slightly. "And has it?" A pause, then a shaky nod. He didn't wait for more. He turned and walked with calm precision back toward the security checkpoint. The people in the terminal watched him move, his massive frame unmistakable, but it wasn't the size that caught their attention. It was the silence around him. He wasn't signing autographs. He wasn't joking. He wasn't smiling. He was looking for something, for someone. Near the TSA counter, he found a supervisor, thin, glasses, a badge clipped to her blazer, posture rigid. "I need to know where my wife is," Shaq said. The woman blinked, unsure whether to treat him like a VIP or a problem. "Sir, I'm sure the matter's being handled." "What matter?" There was an issue with her documentation. Shaq's brows furrowed, eyes steady. "Her passport?" "Yes. It's valid. There was suspicion of tampering. She renewed it last year. Government sealed. You're saying it was fake?" "We're saying we needed to verify some things." "She was taken to secondary. Alone?" The woman nodded. "No lawyer? No phone?" "It's standard." Shaq took a step back, not away, just enough to collect his breath. Then he said, "Take me to her." The supervisor hesitated. "I'm not sure." He stared at her, not angry, just waiting. The way a mountain waits for the wind to understand who's immovable. She caved. Down a gray hallway, through 2 key-locked doors, and past a quiet operations room. They reached a plain steel door. The supervisor swiped her badge and gestured toward the entry. Shaq stepped inside. Shawnee was seated at a metal table, her posture dignified despite the obvious tension in the room. Her phone was gone. Her passport lay beside her, edges sliced like someone had been preparing evidence. A folder sat near the officer's elbow, half filled with scribbled notes and a printed accusation. Possible forgery, pending verification. Shaq didn't speak for a moment. He just looked at her. Her eyes met his, calm but raw. There were no tears, no dramatic gestures, just a shared understanding that something had been crossed, not a legal line, a human one. He turned slowly toward the officer in the room. Young, nervous now. His hands shuffled papers as if that might shield him from what was coming. Shaq walked closer and placed a single hand on the table, palm flat. I need you to explain to me, he said quietly, why my wife is in this room, and why her passport looks like it's been torn in half by suspicion. The officer fumbled. Sir, this is standard.
No, it's not.
Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't accuse. But the weight behind his stillness was undeniable. The officer tried again. We had concerns. Her name O'Neill. It didn't match our initial record pull. And the dual surname raised red flags. Shaq's jaw tightened. So because she had my name, and not my skin tone, that made her suspect. The officer shifted. It wasn't about race, sir. Shaq didn't blink. You sure about that? Silence. Shoni sat still, but her hand had moved slightly, resting now on the table's edge, fingers brushing the folder. She didn't need to say anything. The visual spoke volumes. The supervisor entered behind them, clearing her throat. We're in the process of clearing everything. The passport's valid. We'll be reissuing a statement. A statement? Shaq said, turning slightly. You cut a U.S. citizen's passport. You isolated a black woman with no legal counsel, no communication, no rights read. You documented her as a suspect before verifying a single detail. She matched a profile. Shaq exhaled, slow and heavy. That's the problem. He turned back to Shawnee. She stood now, composed, still holding the weight of the room with her silence. Let's go, she said. No apology? Shaq asked the supervisor, glancing over his shoulder. We're reviewing our internal conduct. He almost smiled, but not from amusement, from disappointment. That's what you say when you're sorry about the headlines, not the harm. They walked out together, past the eyes of startled employees, through the hallway still echoing with silence. At the terminal's edge, the light felt different, the air less sterile, but neither of them was relieved, because something had changed. Shaq had never doubted this country's flaws, but this was the first time it had touched Markantha. Like that, in public, with surgical detachment. He had spent his whole life learning how to move quietly through rooms that didn't expect his intellect, only his height. But Shahid walked in with documentation, grace and legal grounding, and still ended up treated like an imposter. He sat beside her at gate 17, the plane not yet boarding, his mind quiet but lit with clarity. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Shawnee leaned her head against his shoulder. The confrontation hadn't been loud. It had been quieter than that, and in that quiet something irreversible had shifted. The silence in the holding room was no longer the heavy, anticipatory kind. It had shifted, become something rawer, tighter, like a string stretched just to its breaking point, waiting for one final pull. Shawnee sat across from the TSA compliance officer, her back no longer rigid with endurance, but fluid with truth. She wasn't angry, not visibly, but she was done holding everything in, and what came next didn't sound like rage. It sounded like testimony. She took a breath, not to steady herself, but to declare she didn't need steadying anymore. You want to know who I am? She said, her voice low, clear. You've got my passport, my ID, my boarding pass. But somehow, that's not enough. So let me give you what you really want. My story. Since that's what you think proves I belong here. The officer tried to interject with protocol language, something about verification procedures. But Shawnee lifted a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to signal she wasn't asking for space. She was taking it. I was born in Richmond, Virginia. Grew up with a single mom who worked 2 jobs, and still came home to help me finish my math homework. I graduated top of my class at Howard. Got a full ride to Columbia for law. By 27, I was on a civic board. By 30, I co-founded an advocacy group that helped push through 3 state-level reforms on housing discrimination. The officer blinked. Shaq, standing quietly near the doorway, now allowed in, as a next of kin, didn't move. But his hands, those massive, grounded hands, folded tightly across his chest. He watched Shawnee, not as a husband protecting a wife, but as a witness honoring a force finally released. Shawnee's voice didn't rise. If anything, it became calmer. I met Shaquille after I'd already published 2 books, after I'd already built something, and I didn't marry him for his name. I carried my own legacy into this, but from the minute our names were hyphenated, you'd be surprised how often people started assuming I needed validation, like I stopped being Shawnee Henderson and became someone's +1, like my power was borrowed. She leaned forward now, just slightly, Not confrontational, but rude. You looked at my face, you looked at my skin, and you looked for a reason to question it all. You didn't ask about policy, you didn't check a glitch. You assumed, and then you acted on that assumption. With a blade, cut my passport like you were slicing away my identity. Because in your system, presence like mine comes with an asterisk. The younger officer in the corner shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing the gravity of the moment was no longer theirs to manage. It was Shawnee's to define. My name is on hospital donation plaques, on grant letters, on youth reform bills. I have a line item in the national budget because of the work I've done in underserved communities. But today that wasn't enough, because none of that came printed on my skin, and you read my face before you read my file. The lead officer started to speak again, but Shawnee's gaze turned toward him, not hostile but unflinching. I'm not asking for an apology, she said. I've gotten used to people not knowing what they're apologizing for. I'm asking you to remember this, because next week, you'll stop thinking about today. But I'll carry it, because that's what we do. Every woman who's ever walked into a room credentialed, qualified, and still questioned, we remember. Shaq still hadn't moved. His expression didn't shift, but something else did. The room, the atmosphere, the narrative. She stood, and in that small act, the room no longer belonged to Homeland Security. It belonged to her. My passport is real, she said, but the assumptions you attach to it, those are the forgeries. Shaq walked to her side now. Still no sound from him. But his eyes, sharp, glassy, locked on the officer, spoke the quiet fury he rarely ever voiced. The supervisor who had escorted him earlier re-entered, holding a printout and a trembling apology. The documentation's cleared. The system flagged a misalignment between facial scan protocols and secondary metadata. It shouldn't have escalated this far. Shawnee didn't answer. She just held her hand out. The woman placed the paperwork in it with visible regret. Shaq finally spoke, his voice measured. You held my wife for nearly 2 hours, sliced her passport, took her voice, and now you're saying it's a glitch. The supervisor tried. Sir, with the volume of passengers, we sometimes... You didn't detain volume. You detained her. The room fell silent again. Shaq turned to Shawnee. Ready? She nodded once. As they walked toward the door, she paused. Not for drama, but for something else. She turned to the officers who had now faded into compliance. You didn't break me, she said, but you revealed yourselves. And that'll stay. Then she walked out, tall, unshaken. Shaq followed. Back in the terminal, people stared. They didn't know the full story. Just the silhouette of two figures re-emerging from behind doors people rarely returned from smiling. But Shawnee wasn't just walking back to her seat. She was walking back into herself. And Shaq, the gentle giant, didn't need to comfort her with words. He had heard everything, felt every beat of her story, and he knew exactly what had shifted. She had broken, but not apart. She had broken through. The shift didn't begin with a dramatic outburst. No slamming doors. No shouted apologies. Just one uncertain breath, held too long. Officer Landry, the youngest in the room, had been silent for most of Shawnee's interrogation, her presence barely noted behind the senior staff who led with certainty and condescension. But now, something in Shawnee's words had lodged itself inside her. Not guilt, not yet, but doubt. And doubt, when planted right, doesn't whisper, it rattles. She turned slightly, tapping discreetly into her tablet, as the others moved on to their next line of questioning. Her eyes traced the official databases, citizenship records, philanthropic filings, board appointments, high-level travel clearance from federal outreach programs. One by one, the pages unfolded like a truth she'd never been taught to anticipate. And by the time she reached Shawnee's public civil rights work and direct consultations with 2 senators, her fingers stopped. Her breath hitched. She looked up. Shawnee was still seated, composed but distant, no longer trying to prove herself because she never had to. And Officer Landry, for the first time that day, realized exactly what they'd done. A torn passport. A report filed under potential forgery. An illegal act disguised as procedure. She shifted in her seat. The senior officer noticed. You good? He muttered, low enough that only she heard. Landry nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't match the movement. They were locked on Shawnee now, not in suspicion, but in recognition. She had been trained to detect anomalies, but no one had trained her to recognize systemic bias when it wore a badge, and spoke in protocol. Then Shaq stepped closer. The giant who had held back so long, who had let the room speak itself into a corner, finally moved with purpose, not heavy, not aggressive, just deliberate. He stood by Officer Landry's desk, towering without menace, and asked a question that didn't sound like accusation. "Who taught you how to see us?" His voice was soft, introspective, even. But the question cracked like thunder. Not at her, through her. And Landry, caught between allegiance and conscience, said nothing at first. Shaq didn't blink. Because this isn't about policy. It's about pattern. Every time someone who looks like my wife walks into a system like this, and ends up at a table like that, it's not because the form was wrong. It's because the framework is. Landry swallowed hard. Her voice came out quieter than she meant. "I was just following." "Exactly," Shaq interrupted, still calm. "You were following, and no one stopped to ask where it was leading." The room had quieted. The lead compliance officer stiffened, his instinct to regain control flaring in his jaw. "Sir, I assure you this was an isolated." "No, it wasn't," Landry said. The words left her mouth before she could filter them. But she didn't take them back. She looked at her supervisor now, voice steadying. "It wasn't isolated. We flagged her based on assumptions. The name, the tone, the skin, and then we destroyed federal property based on suspicion, not on evidence." Her supervisor glared. "You're out of line." "No, I'm just late," she replied, standing now, late to realize I've been working inside a filter, not a system. Shawnee didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her expression didn't shift, but something in her posture said she'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Shaq stepped back, not to withdraw, but to let the silence speak. It was his gift. Letting truth settle. Landry turned to him. We can reverse the report. But the damage," Shaq nodded once. "We're not here for apologies. We're here to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to my wife. Not to anyone."
The older officer barked out. "With respect, sir, we followed federal protocol."
Shaq finally turned his full height to face the man.
No.
"You followed your version of protocol, the one that makes room for doubt when the face doesn't match your comfort zone. You had all the evidence you needed. You just didn't have the vision." Then he looked around the room. "This doesn't end with clearing Shawnee's name. Her name wasn't the thing in question. It was your assumptions that needed investigating. So here's what we're gonna do. You're gonna file a report. You're gonna note exactly how many officers were involved, and then you're gonna call in oversight, not just HR, real oversight. Because if we let this pass like a clerical error, you're gonna repeat it in a week." Landry nodded slowly. Shaq's voice lowered. "We're not here for revenge. We're here for reform." And with that, a new goal was set. It wasn't about leaving the airport. It was about changing how these airports think, how these institutions act, how systems look at dignity through the lens of bias and call it due diligence. Shawnee stepped forward now, beside Shaq.
"This moment, this scar on my passport, that's permanent, but so is what I do next with it."
So let me be very clear. I'm not walking out of here quietly. I'm walking out with purpose, and I'll be back. Not as a traveler, but as a partner in rewriting how you train people to see what's real. The room stayed silent. Shaq extended a business card, not his own, but one labeled Equity Reform Network, Shawnee's firm, the one she'd been building quietly, while the world only saw her through someone else's fame. "We'll follow up," he said. Landry took the card. Shaq nodded. Shawnee took a final breath. Then they walked out. Together. And behind them for the first time the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a reckoning just beginning. It started with a whisper of pixelated truth. An anonymous passenger phone, barely raised above waist level, had caught it all. The clipped exchange, the folded suspicion, the moment Shawnee Henderson's passport was sliced at the edge by a TSA officer who never raised his voice, but whose certainty was carved in something far sharper than scissors. Assumption. By the time the video hit the internet, it was already too late for containment. A 35-second clip, posted to a niche airport incident subreddit, had ignited a digital inferno. The headline was simple: Shaq's wife detained. Passport cut. No apology. But what turned flames into wildfire were the visuals. Shawnee's calm composure, her silence, the sterile room behind her, and that brief, unmistakable flash of Shaquille O'Neal entering the room. Not angry, not animated, but still as stone. Social media became a battleground of memory and mourning, not just over Shani, but over everyone she had come to represent. Stories poured in. Black travelers detained for secondary screenings, denied clearance for random checks, asked to prove citizenship despite being born blocks from the airport itself. Shani was not an anomaly. She was evident. She was the tip of a glacier submerged in years of systemic frostbite. Within hours, hashtags trended. In Shani deserved dignity. Travel while black. Shaq speaks truth. The algorithms bent beneath the weight of collective exhaustion. TikTok duets layered the footage with grief. Instagram reels turned the still frame of Shani's torn passport into protest art. Twitter boiled with outrage. And under it all, a deeper current pulsed. Not celebrity gossip, not viral scandal, but a confrontation with the quiet violence of normalized suspicion.
News outlets tried to catch up.
CNN ran at top of the hour. NBA legend's wife detained at Atlanta airport. Was it profiling? MSNBC brought in experts on constitutional rights and TSA discretion. Fox News tried awkwardly to pivot the story into a question of protocol over race, but the clip wouldn't let them. It was too human, too unmistakable. The TSA issued its first statement less than 6 hours later. Sterile, predictable. We are aware of the incident involving a passenger and are conducting an internal review to ensure proper procedure was followed. But by then, screenshots of the officer's name badge had already circulated. So had photos of Shani, from philanthropic events, university panels, and her work leading literacy initiatives for underprivileged youth. She wasn't just Shaq's wife, she was a builder of bridges, a bearer of weight. Still, Shani refused interviews. She didn't stand on stages or take morning show calls. Instead, she released a letter, not typed, handwritten, scanned and uploaded to her verified account with no caption. Just her words. To be questioned is part of life. To be erased is another matter. I'm not seeking vengeance. I'm seeking structure. The kind that doesn't buckle when someone walks in wearing dignity instead of proof. What was cut wasn't paper. It was presumption. I'm not the only one it's touched, but I intend to be one of the last. Shaquille didn't go live. He didn't tweet rage. He walked into a scheduled press event for a local youth center the next day. And someone asked. Cameras were already rolling. He paused, nodded, and said, she was calm. They weren't. That's the story. That's the problem. That 5-second clip would become its own anthem, overlaid onto videos of protests, journalistic breakdowns, and public service montages. She was calm. They weren't. It was repeated like scripture across platforms that rarely agreed on anything. Shani's name didn't just trend. It rooted. Not as spectacle. As standard. As pressure mounted, legislators in Georgia called for a federal investigation. Civil rights organizations issued joint demands. Travel advocacy groups started compiling cases, linking Shani's experience to hundreds, no thousands of others, whose stories hadn't come with the spotlight of fame. The officer who'd cut the passport was placed on administrative leave. The supervisor who signed off on the detention quietly deleted their LinkedIn. Internal policy documents were leaked to reporters showing subjective discretion thresholds. A gray zone ripe for bias. TSA leadership scrambled, calling emergency briefings. By the end of the week, the Department of Homeland Security had issued a rare public comment acknowledging the optics of the incident were deeply concerning. But for Shani and Shaq, it was never about optics. They met behind closed doors with legal advisors and community leaders. They held listening sessions, not for cameras, but for clarity. Shaq took calls from travelers, activists, historians, and educators. Shani drafted a proposal, not a demand for punishment, but a framework for mandatory anti-bias certification across all federal travel security staff. She titled it simply, The First Gaze Standard. Because the first look someone gives you shouldn't define the next hour of your life. They presented it to the Senate Committee on Transportation and Security Oversight. Quietly, without cameras, without applause, because this wasn't a moment, it was a blueprint. Meanwhile, the internet kept churning. Some called it overreaction, others called it justice delayed, but no one could unsee the footage. No one could unhear the silence of a woman, waiting for someone to believe her, not because she was famous, but because she was human. Shaq was invited onto national broadcast to speak. He declined most, but when he did appear once, on a late-night news hour, he looked straight at the anchor and said, The thing that hit me most wasn't what they did. It was how normal they made it feel. Like they'd done it before. Like they'd do it again. And that, more than anything, made the world lean in. The climax wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It was precise. Measured. Like Shawnee. It happened in boardrooms, courtrooms, and conference halls. It happened in security line conversations between strangers. It happened every time a TSA agent looked up and hesitated, not because they were afraid to act, but because they'd finally been taught to see. And in that space, something shifted. Not through shouting, but through a refusal to be unseen. Through the kind of storm that doesn't rage. It reforms. The days that followed weren't loud. There were no massive protests, no televised hearings full of outrage. But inside government buildings and behind closed doors, the air thickened. Something irreversible had begun, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. TSA's internal investigation was immediate, but cautious, its tone carefully worded to avoid admitting fault while appearing proactive. But within days the facts were too sharp to soften. The footage couldn't be ignored. The name couldn't be sidelined. Shawnee Henderson's passport wasn't forged. It was issued, verified, pristine, until someone chose to see something else, until someone cut what wasn't broken. The chain of events that followed was swift in silence. Officer Danvers, the one who made the call to damage Shawnee's passport, was quietly let go. No statement, no defense, just a name scrubbed from a roster and a desk left empty. His supervisor, the one who backed the decision under the guise of unusual formatting, was reassigned to administrative processing in a region far from public-facing roles. A memo circulated internally, mandatory retraining, new protocols under review, discretionary screening audits launched. But the real shift happened when Officer Landry stepped forward. Young, mid-20s, new to the job but already weighed by the pressure of what she'd witnessed. She had stayed quiet in that sterile screening room, eyes flicking between her colleagues' confidence and Shawnee's calm restraint. She didn't intervene, but she remembered every detail, every hesitation she felt but didn't voice. When she testified to the Internal Oversight Committee, her voice barely trembled. She never raised her voice, Landry said. She answered everything. She was composed, clear. I knew something felt off. Not about her, about us, but I didn't want to step outside the chain of command. Her admission wasn't a full redemption, but it was rare, real. She owned her silence and labeled it what it was, complicity born of deference. And when asked what changed her mind about coming forward, she said one name, Sean. She didn't fight us. She just let us listen to ourselves. And when you hear yourself in the wrong, it's hard to sleep after. That quote made its way into the media, subtly at first, then louder, because it didn't cast Shawnee as the victim. It cast her as the mirror. Meanwhile, Shawnee remained out of the spotlight. She didn't attend the hearings. She declined offers for televised sit-downs. But she accepted one thing, reinstatement. Her diplomatic clearance, temporarily flagged under review after the incident, was returned with full privileges, a rare move that came with something even rarer. An apology letter signed by the regional director of TSA and co-signed by a Department of State official. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was something more important, an acknowledgement of harm. Shawnee didn't frame the letter. She filed it, because she wasn't looking for trophies. She was building leverage. And while the world speculated what would come next, lawsuit, documentary, memoir, Shaquille O'Neal remained grounded in the shadows of the story. He never let the incident become about him, though many tried. Reporters chased soundbites. Networks asked him to narrate his emotions, but he offered them one final statement, and it wasn't delivered at a podium or via social media. He spoke on a local radio show. Low-key, community-centered. You don't fix systems by punishing people, he said plainly. You fix them by rebuilding what taught them to suspect her in the first place. The line wasn't fiery. It didn't trend. But within weeks, it showed up on the whiteboard in a policy strategist's office at Homeland Security. It was written in the margins of DEI training manuals, being updated at the national level. It echoed in the hallway whispers of airport terminals across the country, especially among the officers who didn't want to be the next name in someone's headline. Back in Atlanta, at the same airport where it all started, a quiet shift unfolded. A new placard appeared in the TSA internal break room, one not designed for public view. It read, "See every passenger as someone who matters." Not because they're known, because they're human. It was attributed anonymously. But some staff suspected Officer Landry. Others suspected Shawnee, herself. Neither confirmed it. Because the point wasn't credit. The point was course correction. By month's end, a new committee was announced. The Traveler Equity Task Force. A public-private partnership involving civil rights groups, travel advocacy organizations, and former travelers with documented grievances. Shawnee was invited to co-chair. She declined. Instead, she nominated someone else, a woman named Brenda McAllister, who had once been detained for using her maiden name while traveling for work and never received a single answer. She deserves the mic, Shawnee said in her reply. Not because she went viral, but because she didn't. The move stunned many, but not Shaq. That's who Shawnee was, always had been. Behind the quiet resolutions and public statements, the system had been shaken, not toppled, but stirred to awareness. And for once, change wasn't reactive. It was reflective. No protest had stormed the terminal. No court order had been forced. But a shift had happened. And the story that began in a quiet moment of unjust suspicion had grown into a national conversation about who we trust, who we detain, and who we believe when they say, "This is who I am." Not every system would change overnight, but now they had no excuse not to try. And somewhere in the hush of that new beginning, Shawnee walked back through that same airport terminal, weeks later. Not escorted, not flagged, and this time, no one reached for scissors. They just nodded, quietly, properly, like she'd always deserved. Weeks had passed since that day at the airport, yet its echo hadn't faded. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It had unraveled into something bigger, something structural. It had rippled from newsrooms to classrooms, from government offices to grassroots conversation. But this story didn't rest on policy or headlines alone. It found its breath in the spaces where the next generation watched and listened, wondering if the world was theirs to shape. Shawnee Henderson stood at the center of a modest but charged auditorium at Westbridge High School, a historically black institution just outside Atlanta. The crowd was filled with young women, some with notebooks, some with braids and beads, others with quiet defiance in their eyes. Future lawyers, writers, teachers, mothers, mayors. They were here because something in Shawnee's story had touched them, not as a spectacle, but as recognition. Behind Shawnee, projected in full view, wasn't a polished headshot or sanitized timeline of accomplishments. It was a high-resolution image of her torn passport still frayed at the edge, its federal seal interrupted by the crude slice of suspicion. The image hadn't been altered, repaired, or reframed. It was the truth, unsoftened beneath it. A caption read, "Not broken, just seen wrong." Shawnee stepped forward without a script. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had already survived the storm. "You don't need a headline to matter," she said. "You don't need someone else to confirm your story before you believe it." The room leaned in, not for drama, for instruction. "That day," she continued, "they looked at me and didn't see a threat. They saw a question they didn't want to answer. And when people can't place you neatly into a box, they label you a mistake. But you are not a mistake. You are not a typo in someone else's idea of order." Her words didn't rise to theatrical levels. They stayed low, rooted. And that's what gave them power. From the back of the auditorium, Shaq watched in silence. No suit, no entourage, just a proud husband in a navy pullover and black slacks, his massive frame almost folding into the plastic auditorium seat. His eyes didn't leave her once, not when she paused, not when she swallowed a hard truth, not even when she raised her hand to gesture toward the torn passport, using it not as a symbol of defeat, but as an anchor. "This," Shawnee said, "was supposed to be evidence that I didn't belong. But I kept it exactly as they left it. I want you to see it. Because this is what happens when you let someone else hold the scissors to your story." The room sat with that for a long breath. A girl in the second row raised her hand. "Did you ever think about leaving? About disappearing from all of it?" Shawnee smiled. "Not wide, but deep. Every day," she answered. "But not because I was afraid. Because I was tired. Tired of proving what should already be visible. But I stayed, because silence never protected me. It just delayed the next misunderstanding." The student nodded slowly. Another voice chimed in from the side aisle. "So how do we change it? Like really change it?" Shawnee folded her arms gently, the way someone does when they're considering truth carefully. By refusing to shrink, even when it's more comfortable. By knowing the systems better than the people who built them. By walking into rooms that weren't made for you and refusing to ask for permission to stay. From the wings, the principal watched, hands clasped, a look of recognition on her face. She knew this wasn't just a guest speaker. This was a blueprint. As the panel wrapped, students gathered at the stage. They didn't want selfies. They wanted conversation. A chance to say, "I saw myself in you." A chance to ask about policy, law school, pressure. Shawnee stayed for all of it. Her voice never faded. Her gaze never flickered. Shaq finally stepped forward. As the crowd began to thin, Shawnee turned to him, and without a word, leaned into his chest. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders. A hug not for comfort, but for acknowledgement. They walked outside together under a wide Georgia sky. The sun still hot, but softened by early autumn air. Reporters waited across the street, cameras low, uncertain whether they should roll. Shaq glanced their way but said nothing. Shawnee, however, paused. She looked directly at them and said, "If you're going to run the story, make sure you mention the students. They're the reason this matters." And then she walked on. Back inside the auditorium, the projection screen remained lit, the torn passport still visible. But for every girl who had seen it now, it didn't look like damage. It looked like a beginning. Because legacy doesn't wait for permission. It walks in, and it doesn't blink. This story isn't just Shawnee's. It's a reflection of every quiet injustice we've let slide through silence. If it stirred something in you, don't let it fade when the screen dims. Start conversations that challenge comfort. Ask the hard questions where they're rarely asked. And when systems tremble, stand steady, because real change waits on the ones who don't.